Welcome in the arena. My name's Allyson Klein. Today, we have a very exciting topic for you. We're talking about the innovation of storage to meet the needs of the AI era. And with that, I've got Jim Sherhart, VP of Products and Solutions from WEKA with us. Welcome, Jim.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So, Jim, WEKA has been on a tear for the last couple of years in innovating around AI models for storage. I'm caught up with you guys. First, a couple of years ago, you talked about your vision for how data should be managed across this distributed computing landscape, and you've been delivering solutions that really hit the market since that point. Do you want to just do an introduction of WEKA, even though you guys have been on the show, just WEKA and your role at the company?
Yeah, sure. So WEKA was founded about 10 years ago. And the problem they set out to solve is if we optimize for lowest possible latency,
Mm-hmm.
can we reinvent like how storage can be built? And so they set out to do that. As you can imagine, it was very difficult. Took a long time to build. But once it hit the market, the performance that the product was able to deliver was so good, a lot of people didn't believe it.
Uh-huh.
And if you think about, 5 years ago, Chat GPT wasn't a thing, AI wasn't as big as it was. A lot of the early workloads were in the HPC space. So things like, genomics research, drug testing, it could be in the automotive industry doing things like crash testing or aerodynamic testing. So that's where the company got its early start. And then AI came on, and really what we've seen is the workloads for AI and the performance demands look very similar. And so, so it's been an easy transition for the company. And so now, just because there's so much build out right now, and it's scaling so fast, there's almost an insatiable demand. And the problems are starting to pivot now, which is really, I think, the interesting thing that we're starting to see in terms of everything going from more of a training sort of workload to now it's all about inference.
That's amazing. Now, you guys came out with some really big news today, so thank you for spending some time with TechArena to share it. We've got the WEKApod 3 and NeuralMesh 6
Yep.
coming to market. Why don't we unpack the news first to get started?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with a little bit of context. So, if you look at the conversation the last couple of years, it's been about GPUs. How do I get faster GPUs? How do I get more GPUs? Because GPUs equated to getting more compute power. And really what's kind of shifted now is many of the bigger companies, like what they're noticing now is with the GPUs is they're not being as efficient as they possibly could. And a lot of that has to do with the workloads. Like with training, that one was pretty much solved. It's like we need to get the data there quickly. We need to have it available for checkpointing. Inference is just completely different. With inference, it's very bursty. Now we're seeing long context come into play with agents. And so the conversation's quickly shifted from how do I get more GPUs to how do I get the most efficiency possible out of the GPUs that I've already got installed. And so like what we've seen with that is, well, really there's more ways than one to solve the problem. So like, there's a lot of talk right now about, token limits, with inside companies, which is, how do we get people to prompt better? How do we get people to use the models smarter? But really, we're trying to solve from the infrastructure layer to say, how can we enable customers to get dramatically more AI from the GPUs they already own? And that's really what this launch is about. So NeuralMesh 6 is our biggest software release ever. WEKApod 3 is actually our first WEKA designed and purpose built hardware specifically for this problem. And so together, they really create a unified AI inference platform designed around all the stuff I just talked about, maximizing GPU utilization, improving data movement, increasing infrastructure density, simplifying operations. And ultimately, what's the thing that everybody wants to do? How can I get the lowest possible cost out of my infrastructure to produce a token? Because I know if I optimize for that, everything else sort of fixes itself. And so to me, that's kind of where the industry's heading. The companies that win going forward won't necessarily be the ones that just have the most GPUs. I think we're gonna find really quickly they're going to be the ones that are going to get the most AI work out of the infrastructure they already own. And so that's exactly what this launch is about.
Now, you guys modeled this around something you're calling the inference economy, which you've been talking about, you've been talking around. In that, your CEO argues that the data center itself has become the bottleneck with power shortfalls, multi-year grid connection queues. I mean, everybody's talking about the challenges of standing up a new greenfield data center, but also the tight NAND market, the tight memory market.
Yeah.
How is your physical reality changing in the way your customers make infrastructure decisions? What are you seeing in the market today?
I mean, I think you nailed it. Like the AI economics really have become the defining challenge, so like when you think about like what you were saying, even if I wanted to go build a data center, like from the time that I decide I want to go do that, assuming I know what I'm going to go do or know how to go do that, it's multiple years, right? So a lot of people are saying I need to increase my AI productivity and my AI throughput and how much AI can handle in the next 6 months. How do I go do that, right? So we know building data centers is going to happen. We know that's a very long lead sort of item. Like you were mentioning now, on top of all the complexities we've got, is this NAND shortage. And so, in the old days, it was like, oh, no problem. I'm going to throw more storage at it. I'll buy more storage arrays. And even if you can find the supply today, it's so expensive to do that that's just not economically viable. And so you've got the GPU, the most expensive, most valuable thing in your data center, right? And we know that in a world of training, that utilization is the most important thing. In the world of inference, there's a new term that's coming out called good put. Because it's interesting, you go talk to people in the inference world and they say, well, my GPUs are really busy. And we're like, they are, but they're recomputing the same tokens over and over again because we know that there's only so much high bandwidth memory on those GPUs. There's only so much DRAM. And then once that gets full, you have more users coming. You've got agentic AI doing longer context windows. That context has to get purged and then recomputed. And so it's all about like, if I know that, how do I make sure that my GPUs are always fed? How do I make sure that I have enough memory so that I can support more concurrent users, more requests, more agents, and be able to do that super efficiently? And then ultimately, how do I, when I know data centers also a limiting capacity, I can only get so much footprint. I'm limited by watts. It's interesting, right? You see a lot of the clouds now, when they announce a new data center or a new funding round, they're talking about how many gigawatts they can get their hands on or how many megawatts they can get their hands on. So that's ultimately the limit. And so if you optimize for all of those things, optimize for footprint, optimize for power, optimize for cooling, optimize to get as much storage possible in the array, that's what we kind of consider to be the new sort of economics around this. And so that's what everybody's focused on right now. And so, I think the one thing that everybody's got to figure out is how do I make inference profitable? Either I'm
Yeah.
going to figure out how to do this profitably or I'm not. And that's going to define whether my business is a success or not. And so that's like become probably the most important thing for a lot of these companies.
I heard a statistic earlier today that Anthropic said something like for every gigawatt they produce $20 billion. And that's an interesting stat because if you can produce more tokens than that gigawatt, it automatically changes the profitability. Um, which is exactly what you're focused on. When I first came across WEKA, you guys were a software company. Now you make the WEKApods. Infrastructure delivery is not for the faint at heart. Why did you make a decision to move into infrastructure, and why is the WEKApod 3 the first of its kind?
I'll tell you a funny story. I'm actually a storage retread. So like I was in the storage industry many, many years ago, earlier part of my career. And when I left to go work for AWS, I basically said, I'm not going to work for any companies that do hardware anymore.
Mhm.
And I think, what really happened is AI made it possible to innovate in infrastructure in a way that really wasn't something anybody was thinking about outside of the hyperscalers.
Mhm.
And so like what I would tell you is that WEKA never set out to be a hardware company or to produce hardware. But when we saw what basically like the inefficiencies, I would say, between our software and the hardware, and it's not that like the hardware that's out there is great hardware, it's general purpose hardware. So like when these companies design it, they got to design it so that it works across all the different software out there. Well, we built NeuralMesh in a really unique way. And because it's extremely efficient, there are things that we can do in the software that can be unlocked with the right hardware. And so really that's what we set out to do. And so like if you were to say, start with a clean sheet of paper, design the most perfect piece of hardware for NeuralMesh, what does that look like? And it would look like WEKApod 3. And so some things that allowed us to do, just to give you an example, is because we're very efficient in terms of how we use CPUs, we're able to use lower power CPUs to keep the thermals down, still get excellent performance. That allows us to put more drives in that unit. So at the end of the day, that gives us more capacity density and then also more performance density, which are really the two things that are the most important. So for us, I would say, we also joke, we're like, customers are not asking for more hardware or new hardware design. But when you can go in and say, hey, we designed this specifically with our software, and as an AI platform or AI system, what that's able to deliver together is 10x what we could deliver before. All of a sudden now that becomes very compelling and very interesting for customers. And so, it's funny. I started in the storage industry when we still had, you know, gigabyte drives, right? And so now, like, obviously we moved to terabytes. We're getting close to a quarter petabyte drives, and so the fact that now that we're pushing racks, with conservative data compression to over an exabyte, I mean, if I'm an AI cloud, and I'm trying to figure out how to scale my business profitably, like, we've completely changed the economic equation for them. So now with our augmented memory grid on the same hardware, we could get 10 times as much tokens through the same GPUs. And then now you put the WEKApod in place of that and say, not only can we do this on the same hardware, but now with our storage, we can offer you 3 times as much capacity, in the same footprint, or 10 times as much performance in the same footprint. Now all of a sudden, that changes everything about how they thought about how they're going to build their infrastructure and scale their business profitably. And that's what's really exciting. And so that's why we did hardware, not because we wanted to, but because it made a lot of sense for us.
Now you did launch 2 products side by side, and, this is not an appliance that you're selling, which, could have been a route to actually delivering this to market. Why did you decide to keep them independent, and what does that tell you about your commitment to choice for your customers?
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that the most important thing for people to understand about NeuralMesh is it's software.
Mhm.
We built it to be software defined, and we did that for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest ones was customers want flexibility in how they deploy it. And especially in a world where, GPUs are a scarce resource, and an expensive resource. So for example, if I have jobs that I'm running and maybe I've got 100 or hundreds of GPUs and I'm renting them in the cloud, and now all of a sudden the next generation comes out, or, GPU pricing drops by 20%, on a different cloud provider, like, that's material to my business. And so by having a software defined storage system that says, well, I can run that on premise, I can run that in the cloud, I can run it in a hybrid mode. That kind of flexibility is one of the most important things for our customers. And so, we never want to lose sight of that. And really what WEKApod does is it just enhances the overall story to say, hey, if you're an AI cloud and you're building out net new infrastructure and you're thinking about density, like, this is something that could be really interesting for you. Or Mr. Enterprise customer, you were running a lot of pilots in pre-production AI to do testing in the cloud, but now you're going to build the infrastructure to do it on-prem. This could be really interesting to you. So I just think it adds another option for our customers, depending on what they're trying to optimize for and how they want to build.
Now, Jim, you mentioned the 10x higher token throughput. That was backed not just by WEKA, but also by Oracle Cloud, OCI. They also claimed 7x more tokens in the same GPUs using your augmented memory grid,
Yep.
which I think you called different things over the years. Tell me what's going on under the hood in terms of the technology that's making that happen.
Yeah. So we actually, we announced augmented memory grid over a year ago. And so, like, we were one of the first to recognize, hey, this is a tip of the iceberg problem that's coming. And I think a lot of the market was able to ignore it because it wasn't causing a lot of pain at the time. But if you look at the last 6 months, it's completely flipped now, and now everybody's trying to figure this out. And so, what we said is, we said, if you just look at just the hardware architecture of a GPU. HBM, very fast, very expensive memory, most valuable memory, I would argue, on the planet. You've got maybe a couple hundred gigs of that. Then once that gets full, you spill over to the DRAM. Well, how many terabytes of DRAM can a system support ultimately, right? And once that gets full, then you're out of memory, and the GPU just starts. It has no other choice but to throw away the context. And so that does two things. That limits how many tokens you can do, and it limits how many users you can actually support on that GPU. And so we saw that problem early and we said, well, hey, wait a minute. The way that we've designed NeuralMesh in our file system is extremely fast because we've optimized for latency. Normally, it's very difficult to build now an extended memory system on NVMe drives and make it fast enough. That's why we also talk about a metric called time to first token. So a lot of companies can do this, but to do it at what I would call DRAM speeds, that's difficult. And at the end of the day, if you can't do it fast enough, what that looks like is a poor experience for the user. So I put in my request to chat and I'm going back and forth. And I don't know why, but it's taking forever to come back with a response, right? And we all get annoyed by that. And that's that time to first token. So like by being able to expand memory by 1000x, do it on really cost effective NVMe drives that a lot of times customers already have, available to them, and be able to do it at DRAM speeds, now like you've just completely changed what you're able to do with the GPUs that you have in your data center. So it's exciting. And, I think the thing is because we're early in the market, we've learned a lot. So I was at AWS and one of the things Andy used to say is there's no compression algorithm for experience.
Mhm.
And I think that's totally true here as well. So like as you said, we've pretty much gone to all the clouds and said, take a look at this, test this, let us know what you think. CoreWeave came back. They were one of the first to test it. And, even in a configuration where we didn't have what I would call the optimal number of GPUs, they saw a 420% improvement.
That's
And
amazing.
then we tested on Oracle, as you mentioned, 7x tokens through the same GPUs, 10x, number of concurrent users. And we've seen it now with all of the different cloud providers that have tested it. Nebius, saw that metric I was talking about before, the good put go up by 7x. Firmus has seen a 7x improvement. And so, when when you're spending what you're spending on GPUs and storage is such a small percentage, but now you can think about storage more strategically in terms of it's the machine that feeds my GPUs and makes them efficient. Now things get really interesting. And so we're one of the first. And so it's really exciting to see what we're able to do to change the economics here.
So when you think about storage as an efficiency driver from that context, I got to ask the question, when you look at this from an economic standpoint, what do you think your customers should be thinking about in terms of increased TCO from their data center infrastructure?
Yeah, you can look at it through two lenses, right? You can look at it through the lens of I'm an AI cloud. I've committed or I have a footprint of a certain number of GPUs. Then it's all about squeezing the most out of that possible. You can also look at it through the lens of an enterprise that maybe is renting GPUs, right? So if you were able to go to an enterprise and say, hey, you're renting 100 GPUs today. Would it be interesting if you could do the same amount of work on 10 GPUs and cut that cost down by 90%? I think a lot of people would find that interesting. Or on the flip side of that, would it be interesting to have those 100 GPUs be able to do 10 times as much work? So like who wouldn't want that? And so like I think for a lot of people, it's an opportunity to rethink like how they're doing that. And so for companies where maybe they're saying, hey, we only have a certain number of GPUs, we really got to limit which teams are using them, or we got to prioritize, the most important jobs, even though there might be some really innovative stuff happening. Like now you can say, hey, bring it on. We can actually do all this work in the same footprint for the same cost. So I think that's really exciting.
Now, I know the WEKA team has been talking a lot about metrics, and you've talked about a few on the podcast, including TTFT, time to first token. I think that one question that I had for you is if you're going to send a message to IT organizations that are looking at building out their AI infrastructure over the next couple of years, what should they be measuring that they probably aren't today?
Well, if you look at storage historically, the metric that everybody hangs their hat on is throughput.
Hmm.
How many gigabytes per second? And I think that's still an important metric,
Hmm.
because ultimately that will limit you. But there's also like one of the things that we're super proud of is how many IOPS we can push.
Yeah.
So, when you look at workloads that use large files that are predictable and sequential, like, training or traditional HPC, throughput's an important metric. When you look at inference, and really what you're looking at is now a lot of small files, a lot of
Right.
random, no patterns to follow, IOPS becomes super important. But then if I also put on my hat now and I think about it through an economic lens, it's some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier. It's like, what's my cost to produce a token? Or what's my cost to produce 1 million tokens? Because that's really the kind of the metric that's emerging right now. So, how many tokens can I squeeze out of every watt of power I have in my data center? I think that's another one that's becoming super important. What does my GPU efficiency look like? And how can I measure like how much of the tokens that are being computed by my GPUs are actually tokens that are net new tokens providing like outcomes and value versus recomputations. Like, so I think a lot of people are going to start looking at, hey, what are my GPUs? I know they're busy. What are they really doing? And how much output am I getting from my business? And then you're going to have somebody who's obviously going to be looking at the economic side of it, which is, hey, you guys can worry about all the performance stuff. That's great. What I want to know is what's it going to cost me to produce 1 million tokens? And how many tokens am I going to be able to fit in this data center where we're limited in terms of how much power we got? So like, I think there's an economic lens and I think there's a performance lens that are related. I think it just depends and matters on who you're talking to and what they care about. But yeah, the performance metrics and the business metrics that are coming in this new economy are definitely shifting. And the conversations we're hearing are all around the things that I just talked about.
Jim, it's a wonderful time to be in tech. Um, Glad you went back into the industry and dove into infrastructure. Congratulations on the announcements of NeuralMesh 6 and WEKApod 3 today. I mean, just another testament to WEKA's continuous innovation. And I love how you're pushing the envelope for your customers. Congratulations.
I appreciate that.
Final question for you. Where can folks find out more about these new solutions and engage your team?
Yeah, yeah. So I'd encourage them to go to our website, weka.io. So there's a spot on our site called the Cache, and it's a cool little repository with all of the news and the information on the launch. So our CEO Laurent actually did a really nice blog on there that pieces everything together. So excited for the launch, and like you said, who knew it was going to be such an exciting time to be in storage and in infrastructure, and the fact that you can still innovate in hardware, that's kind of a cool new thing that's happening. So yeah,
Thanks for being on the show today. It was awesome.
awesome. Thanks so much, Allison.